New York woke up hard. A faint light barely penetrated through the low clouds, and the city beneath it was drowned in endless snow, which alternately intensified and weakened, as if listening to human nerves. A small but stubborn aircraft, a Delta Airlines MD-88, was gliding in a wide arc over the bay. Its silver fuselage was almost invisible among the white suspension, and the two-tail engines, humming faintly, drove the car lower and lower, to a short strip that lay right at the edge of the dark, cold waters of Flushing Bay. Below, under a thick blanket of snow, the warm glow of the lights of LaGuardia Airport, which was operating at its last limit on this stormy March morning, broke through. The wind played with the snowdrifts scattered on the platform. Snow fell in loose layers from the roofs of the terminals, and short flashes of special equipment beacons cut through the whitish chaos. Here, in this difficult corner of New York, the very air was always tense, as if waiting for the next plane, which, by definition, should fit into a space too small for his ambitions. The MD-88, which entered the last decades of its career, flew confidently. But those few minutes before boarding were no longer a standard part of any flight. They became something much bigger, a test of experience, endurance, and the ability to make decisions when the only thing visible ahead was a curtain of snow and the dark silhouette of the bay on the side. A few hours ago, everything seemed much more normal. It was a quiet spring morning in Atlanta, where Flight 1086 was starting. In the terminal, people were calling their families, discussing plans, and flipping through newspapers. This flight was a routine one of those that the country is filled with every day. 127 passengers were on board. Some were heading home, some for work, and some were just traveling and hoping to spend a few quiet days in New York. Of course, no one thought that this particular plane would never take to the skies again after landing today. The MD-88 was an old timer in Delta's fleet, reliable, proven, and familiar. A car with character, with recognizable outlines, and the hoarse sound of the tail engines that have been dragging it along domestic routes across the country for decades. The pilots loved him for his responsiveness, for his simplicity, for knowing what to expect from him. This aircraft really had a great reputation, despite its age, despite the fact that aeronautical progress had already moved far ahead. But there was one subtlety built into the MD-88's design, one engineering nuance that rarely manifested itself until certain conditions developed. Snow, a short strip, a strong thrust reversal, all this could result in what was called darkening of the steering wheel in the language of pilots. And today, all these factors were preparing to meet at one point. The crew, two calm, confident, experienced men, knew their plane better than many others. The commander, 56-year-old Theodore Lauer, has spent most of his life in the sky. Combat missions in the U.S. Air Force, countless training sessions, thousands of hours on MD-80. Calmness, a cool head, the habit of calculating everything 2 steps ahead. All this was in his character. Next to him sat the first officer, 46-year-old David Phillips, milder in temperament, but no less professional. They both knew that snow was not uncommon in New York in March. Nevertheless, already at the height where the liner had just begun its journey to the cruiser, the first tense notes of conversation arose. They were discussing the weather. We discussed it too often. Not as an ordinary part of the briefing, but as a topic that seemed to require more and more clarifications. The reports were replaced by one another. snowstorms on the East Coast, deteriorating visibility, possible delays. None of this was a reason to panic. Such situations are not uncommon for the crew. But a shadow of doubt has already fallen on the conversation. Will it be possible to land in LaGuardia? Or will we have to go to an alternate airfield? And most importantly, will there be enough clear lanes to stop the heavy MD-88, which was refueled almost to capacity on this flight? As they flew to New York, the issue only grew. Lauer and Phillips contacted the Delta dispatcher several times, trying to figure out in advance whether it was worth stubbornly holding on to LaGuardia, or it would be wiser to go to a place where the weather was more predictable. There was no alarm in their voices, just the cautious, professional alertness that always appears in a crew when variables multiply faster than they can be accounted for. But now the weather has begun to clear up one thing: landing will not be easy. According to calculations, the wind was close to the maximum values. The strip is short, the snow is significant, and the braking effect, the only parameter that could give them confidence in a safe landing, remained unknown. There were no recent reports. The lane was being cleaned. No one sat down, which means no one could tell what the actual adhesion was on it. This uncertainty became the first real source of internal pressure. The pilots discussed that if they waited too long, they risked getting into a situation where the fuel was running low and the braking effect would be average or worse. Then the decision to retire to the reserve will be forced, which means that all these expectations will be in vain. When Flight 1086 was instructed to stand in the waiting area, it became clear that the matter was taking a serious turn. The commander noted with displeasure that no one had announced such a scenario in advance. The situation became overgrown with nuances. As time passed, the snow intensified, and any attempt to hold out a little longer became more risky. Nevertheless, the crew continued to work methodically, calmly, according to checklists. They checked the landing tables, the weight of the aircraft, the configuration of the flaps, the wind. The calculation showed that in order to stop on the snow-covered strip of LaGuardia, they need a braking effect of at least good. Any decrease in this indicator meant the risk of a long run, too long for the short Runway 13, which ended not just with a fence, but with a coastline near the icy water. Meanwhile, the first fragmented messages from other crews were coming from below. One car reported poor braking. The other one, after a few minutes, is about the good stuff. In clear weather conditions, there would be no doubt about it. But today, with the wind gusting and the snow covering, every new phrase on the radio felt like a coin being thrown into the air and waiting to see which side it would fall on. While the MD-88 was approaching New York airspace, the commander made a decision. Next, he was flying the plane himself. Phillips gave up the levers, as always happens if conditions are close to the minimum. Lauer was older, more experienced, more confident on the MD-88. He knew how this car behaves at low speeds, how it reacts to snow, how it feels in his hands in the last seconds before touching. The waiting area continued, and the tension grew by the minute. Not critically, but noticeably. From the cockpit, there was a view of endless swirls of snow streams that stretched parallel to the airways, as if the city was covered with a white blanket, from which there were no truly free areas. Finally, the command came. You can start the descent. The MD-88 turned into the right sector, gently making a U-turn. The snow became denser, and the wind speed changed erratically, not in jerks, but with that typical unpleasant rocking that makes pilots hold the handle and pedals a little tighter. LaGuardia was difficult to recognize today. The lights seemed dim. The contours of the stripes were blurred. Even the usual ground landmarks were lost. But the crew came across short but important messages. The lanes are being cleared, the equipment is working, there are no restrictions on landing. There was a working silence in the cabin. Only checklists, confirmations, and dry commands. One by one, the control elements went through. Landing gear release, flap configuration, spoiler preparation, and automatic braking. Max Auto, the maximum of the automatic brake. LaGuardia left no choice. Lauer and Phillips already knew that they would have to land carefully, but hard, with minimal loss of distance, in the snow, in windy conditions, at the end of a short runway. And although they were ready, none of them knew yet that when a streak of snow appeared, they would see something completely different from what they expected. The snow continued to thicken. The plane crossed mark after mark, slowly, confidently plunging into space, where the decision on the fate of the flight would depend on a few moments, and the force with which the commander's hand would pull the thrust reverse, a little stronger or a little weaker. This difference will become the boundary between the usual landing and what will be included in the reports. At first, the approach lights appeared, blurred, trembling, as if floating in the air. They appeared through the white haze in barely discernible dots, as if someone had carefully brought a flashlight to the screen. The commander looked ahead, without changing his expression, and quietly announced that he was continuing. At this height, a decision requires confidence, and he had it. The MD-88 held gently but firmly on the glide path, and the speed steadily decreased. But just a few seconds later, the band itself appeared out of the snow haze. And what was revealed to the crew did not match any of their expectations. Instead of the characteristic gray canvas with small remnants of snow, instead of strips of dark asphalt between areas of loose cover, they saw a white, flat surface, the entire length of runway 13, from the entrance end to the far edge. The strip was completely covered with snow. Not a single dark area. No traces of previous landings. There are no signs that the cleared strip will stand for at least a minute. It seemed that the snow had fallen on top of the newly cleared canvas again so quickly that all the efforts of the ground services were dissolved in a few gusts of winter wind. Phillips instinctively held his breath, waiting for the commander's reaction. Lauer was completely focused at that moment. He tilted the nose of the plane slightly, not sharply, not aggressively, but only so that the liner touched the ground a little earlier than planned. In such a short lane, the distance margin is measured in tens of meters, not hundreds. Every second of the run was important. The plane glided gently down, the snow on the windshield turned into cloudy trickles, and only the silhouette of the far end of the runway gave an understanding of where the safe zone ends. And then there's the touch. Precise, confident, without a jerk. The fuselage shook slightly, transmitting to the cabin the characteristic vibration of the landing gear, the feeling of solid ground under the wheels. Automatic spoilers instantly rose up, pressing the main pillars to the surface. It was a moment when pilots should feel in control. The plane was under them, the brakes were ready, the course was stable. But this time, the control disappeared almost immediately. Lauer, without wasting a single fraction of a second, reached for the reverse levers and confidently moved them forward, as they had been trained for decades, quickly, so as not to waste precious braking time. And it was in that split second that something changed in the cockpit. There was a slight, almost imperceptible shift, so subtle that the pilots could initially mistake it for wind. It was not the movement of the plane, but a hint, a premonition. But after a moment, this hint became the behavior of the machine. The MD-88 began to turn its nose slowly, almost lazily, to the left. It's only a few degrees, but it's enough to make an experienced pilot's stomach clench. Lauer immediately pressed the right rudder pedal, trying to return the course. But the reaction was weak, much weaker than it should be normally. The nose was hit by a mixture of snow and a powerful airflow, which the reverse directed forward and sideways. And it was this flow that caused the rudder to stop holding, as it should. The flow from the reverse of the tail engines literally covered the rudder blowing, the very effect that engineers called rudder darkening. Phillips noticed what was happening almost immediately. A slight tremor in the cabin, a shift to the right of the body, the same slippery snow under the wheels. He felt this turn before he realized it with his eyes, and he said it briefly, loudly, clearly, "Get out of reverse. Get out of reverse." But Lauer was sure that he just needed to stay the course a little. He pressed harder. I checked the spoiler. He looked at the instruments, and at that very moment, he made a move that became a turning point. He pulled the reverse levers a little harder, trying to help the brakes. This turned out to be enough for the flow from the left engine to become more powerful than the right one. The EPR parameter tape will then record left reverse 2.07, right 1.91. Is there a slight difference? In the dry lane, yes. On snowy, slippery, and low adhesion roads, this is critical. The plane began to move to the left, no longer by a hint, but by a clearly felt movement. "Get out of reverse," Phillips repeated. But there was already a different intonation in his voice. Harsh, demanding, on the verge of shouting. Lauer removed the reverse gear, but the moment of inertia was already working against them. The MD-88, continuing its run, seemed to be sliding on ice, not obeying the pedals and brakes. The right brake was almost fully applied, but it was difficult to change direction without blowing the steering wheel. The plane did not react the way it was trained in the simulator. He was moving along his own trajectory, to the left, further and further from the center. To the right lay the middle of the strip. To the left, the edge, invisible under the snow. The pilots knew this configuration by heart. A narrow runway, then a piece of land, then a perimeter zone, and then the shore of Flushing Bay. Hitting the edge of the lane could damage the uprights. Hitting the guardrail can damage the fuselage. Hitting the embankment will disrupt the fuel system. The MD-88 tilted slightly, but it was enough for the crew to realize that an uncontrolled departure was beginning. The snow behind the cockpit billowed in white clouds, as if the plane had been sliced through a winter storm by the fuselage blade. The engines hummed in a low, husky tone. The wheels ran over the snow-covered surface as if they were walking on a thin ice crust. And at that moment, all the efforts of the crew boiled down to one thing: to keep the plane on the runway for at least a few more seconds until the speed dropped. But she wasn't falling fast enough. The left edge of the runway approached. Too fast. It's too harsh. The impact did not occur as a flash, but as a heavy shock, a dull, oppressive sound that reverberated throughout the body. The plane crossed the runway boundary, breaking the low airport fence along the way. In this area, there were only patches of dry earth under the dense snow, but after a few meters, an embankment began near the water. The left wing hit her first, not with a blow, but with a scratch. A sliding pressure that tore open one of the panels. The smell of fuel was immediately felt inside, sharp, unpleasant, filling the air with a sense of danger. Almost nothing stopped the plane. He moved along the embankment, leaving a trail as if ripping through the snow with his body. The passengers in the cabin were screaming. Someone was holding onto the seats. Someone was pressing their hands to the armrests so hard that their knuckles were white. The light was blinking, not from impacts, but from vibrations transmitted through the structure. It was only after tens of meters that the hull began to slow down. Grinding, friction, snow, earth. A little more, and the car froze. The nose was hovering over the edge. Another half-meter, and he would have ended up in the icy waters of the bay. But the plane stopped. He stood at an angle, as if looming over Flushing Bay, but firmly, definitively. Silence fell instantly, so abruptly that it seemed unreal. The commander tried to turn on the comm, but to no avail. The impact cut off the power supply. The radio was silent. There was a hum of voices in the cabin, alarm shouts, and the crackle of metal cooling down after loading. And only one thing was clear. The reaction time was limited. The plane was standing on the edge of the world in the midst of snowy chaos. All around there is silence, snow, and the cold air of the bay. And the crew did not yet know that on the ground, controllers continue to give landing permits to other aircraft, not having the slightest idea that Flight 1086 has not been on the runway for a long time. The plane stood motionless, as if frozen in the snow. Only the rare vibrations coming from the internal systems that were still working reminded us that 132 lives had just been trapped in the metal shell, each of which had not yet come to the realization of what had happened. An uneasy silence reigned inside the cabin, broken only by the muffled voices of passengers. It took people a while, just a few seconds, to realize that they weren't moving anymore, but they weren't on the runway either. The nose of the plane hovered over the dark water of Flushing Bay. The interior is slightly tilted forward, as if the MD-88 was frozen in the moment before falling, held only by an earthen embankment. There is a whitish haze outside the window. Only individual contours could be discerned through it. A broken fence, snowdrifts, a strip of land between the airport and the shore. The pilots in the cockpit worked quickly, checking instruments, trying to reconnect, but there was almost no reaction. The power supply was cut off by a blow. The radio stations were silent. Speakerphone too. The commander tried different switches several times, but they all remained lifeless, as if the plane had been cut off from the world. In the cabin, people looked at each other, not knowing whether to wait for the command or climb up on their own. The passengers on the left side saw only the white walls of the embankment through the portholes, against which the fuselage was pressed. Those on the right saw emptiness, a space stretching down to the bay. This view was especially frightening. It seemed that if you took a step in the wrong direction, the car could fall off. Phillips turned to the commander. They both knew that the formal course of action was obvious: to assess the situation and decide whether evacuation was necessary. But the connection wasn't working. I couldn't even hear the sound from the speakers. And those few seconds of indecision became one of the strangest moments of the whole incident. Usually, if an aircraft is damaged, especially near water, or if there is a possible malfunction of the fuel system, evacuation begins immediately. But the commander, assessing the lack of fire and the apparent stability of the situation, decided to wait. He gave a curt command, but without sufficient emotional coloring. Not one that would make the flight attendants act instantly. It took longer than expected. The commander gives the order about 6 minutes after the stop. But his words, spoken in a casual tone, sounded more like a clarification than an order. They sounded hollow and ambiguous in the cabin. The passengers did not understand that they needed to act immediately. Some stood up, looked around, picked up their bags, and asked questions to the flight attendants, who themselves did not fully understand the scale of the event due to the lack of communication. And while uncertainty reigned in the cabin, the airport continued to live its life outside. At LaGuardia Tower, the dispatcher was calling Flight 1086 again. Delta 1086, confirm the landing. The silence on the air was not immediately alarming. Snow, low clouds, noise, all this could temporarily drown out the transmission. But then the dispatcher gave permission for the next plane to enter runway 13. He still did not know that the MD-88 was missing from the lane. It was only after a few minutes that randomness began to change the situation. The snowplow, moving along the cleaning area, turned onto a maintenance road and suddenly saw in front of it a silver body, a twisted fence, and a wing resting against an earthen slope. The driver of the special equipment immediately radioed an alarm call. "A plane has been detected outside the runway. I repeat, the plane is off the runway." The tower was alert, but asked again, not immediately making out the words over the noise of the radio channel. "Confirm. Do you have a flight outside the runway?" "Yes, MD-88. Services are required." Only then did the dispatcher realize the scale of what had happened. He declared, "Runway 13 closed." Then the whole airport. On the radar screens, Flight 1086 was listed as having landed safely. But now it became clear that the incident was serious. While the emergency services were just moving to the place, the long-awaited evacuation began in the cabin. But it started slowly. The flight attendants, having finally received clear instructions, began to act. But the lack of an energetic order and general confusion made the process protracted. People got up from their seats, took their hand luggage, tried to put on jackets, scarves, and took out their phones. Common household instincts that always manifest themselves in the absence of a sharp danger signal. On the port side, the emergency ladders were deployed carefully. In front of them was a snowy embankment, slippery, uneven. There is a dangerous slope on the right, and the crew had to carefully choose the exit point so that no one would fall on the slope to the water. The first passengers descended almost 12 minutes after the plane stopped, an incredibly long time by aviation standards. The evacuation lasted about 5 minutes, although the standard was 90 seconds. Still, people were lucky. There was no fire, there was no smoke, there was no fuel spreading inside the cabin. There was only snow, cold, and amazing calmness after a strenuous run. When the passengers gathered on the ground, they were surrounded by emergency crews. Rescuers helped those who slipped or suffered minor injuries. Doctors examined the condition of people, covered them with warm blankets. Radio silence no longer mattered. There were already people on site who could help. In the cockpit, Lauer and Phillips sat motionless for several seconds, allowing themselves to comprehend everything that had happened for the first time. They did everything they could at the moment when control was going away, but now that the tension has subsided, a question has arisen in the depths that torments every pilot after such incidents. Where exactly was the turning point? At what second? In what hand movement? They didn't know yet that the investigation would soon answer these questions with all the precision of digital records, deeper than human memory could allow. Amid the bustle, special equipment, and rescuers, under the snow and sirens, the MD-88 stood silently and heavily. The fuselage was torn at the wing, the skin was crumpled. Fuel glistened under the plane, instantly crystallizing in the frosty air. Were they safe? Yes. But saved lives are just the beginning of the story. Then another chapter began, analyzing the causes, finding errors, analyzing solutions. The work that aviation always does with one goal in mind: to ensure that this never happens again. When the first specialists of the National Transportation Safety Board arrived at the destroyed MD-88, it was still early in the morning. The snow continued to fall, covering the traces of the incident with a fresh, thin layer, as if nature was trying to erase the very fact of this event. But beneath this white veil, the most important clues were hidden. The torn fence, footprints extending to the left of the lane, the characteristic curve of the wheel track at the moment of loss, of course, and there's a long furrow along the embankment where the plane got stuck. Specialists carefully bypassed the remains of the fuselage, fixed the damage, photographed every centimeter. Their work has always been built on calmness. No rush, no emotion, just scrupulousness. At such moments, it may seem to an outsider that the catastrophe has long been left behind. But for the investigators, everything was just beginning. They understood that despite the fact that all the passengers survived, the accident was very serious. And the fact that there was no fire is more likely a successful combination of circumstances rather than the merit of technology. Their task was to understand why the plane lost control in the first seconds after touchdown, and whether it could have been prevented. The flight recorders contain the answer to every such question. Among the snow and metal, experts found orange containers, inside which the digital flight memory was stored. Engine parameters, pitch angle, rudder position, speed, direction. The second recorder, a voice recorder, contained recordings of conversations in the cockpit. The way the crew spoke, the phrases they uttered, the pauses they allowed, all this was an important part of the overall picture. In the NTSB labs, the data began to show a clear sequence. The landing took place on the course, the alignment was correct, the touch was within the normal range. Then there is a sharp increase in thrust reversal. The value recorded on the left engine was 2.07 EPR. On the right, 1.91. These figures shocked even experienced investigators. For the MD-80, such values meant a powerful forward airflow, so strong that it blocked the rudder, blowing on the tail. The steering wheel was losing its ability to adjust course. Any attempt to deflect the plane back onto the axis of the runway became ineffective, almost pointless. And it was known long before this incident. Rudder dimming is a long-standing feature of MD-80 tail engines. Delta's training programs, like any other airline, had a clear recommendation. On wet or snowy lanes, do not exceed the EPR of about 1.3. On dry, 1.6. Lauer exceeded this limit by almost half at the time of landing. But the investigators were in no hurry to put this in the category of human error. It was more complicated than that. Why did an experienced commander, who had flown the MD-88 for decades, suddenly turn on the reverse gear so much? Why didn't you react faster to the words of the first officer? Why didn't I return the reverse immediately, as soon as I felt a departure from the course? To answer this, experts investigated not only the technical side, but also the psychological one. A pilot's job is not just a set of checklist actions. It is a continuous chain of decisions under the pressure of time, information, and emotions. And sometimes the human brain chooses a strategy that seems logical in a moment of stress, but leads to the wrong result. This strategy has become a phenomenon that experts have called intentional tunneling. The intentional tunneling of attention. When a person is faced with a heavy workload and limited reaction time, attention narrows. This is an ancient mechanism that allows you to focus on only one thing, the most important, according to the brain, the stimulus. But that's where the danger lies, because everything that is outside this tunnel is ignored or perceived too late. The moment the plane touched down on the runway, the commander's brain chose the only priority: to stop the car. He saw the snow. He saw a short runway. He saw figures that could mean poor braking performance after calculations. He had already been discussing with the dispatcher for an hour the risk that the lane would be slippery, that braking might not be enough. And when the wheels touched the snow, it was this thought that became dominant. He saw the most dangerous thing, as it seemed to him, and focused on it completely. Everything else, the reaction of the aircraft, the asymmetry of the reverse, the hint of the first officer, remained as if on the periphery of consciousness. The information was coming in, but it did not have time to get into that narrow focus of attention where the brain had invested all its resources. When Phillips shouted, "Get out of reverse!" the commander heard his voice. But the meaning of these words was already making its way through the noise, through its own internal priority, to achieve a slowdown. On the recording, it is heard that Phillips repeated the command, but by that time, the trajectory had already gone too far to the left. The investigators noted that Lauer did not monitor the EPR readings of the very scale that could have given him an idea of the critical moment. His gaze darted between the spoilers, the lane, the pedals, but did not linger on the instruments that showed the parameters of the engines. This was another sign of tunneling, focusing on the tactile and visual sensation of sliding rather than analyzing digital parameters. When the plane left the runway, even the commander, judging by the recording, did not immediately understand the scale of the unfolding event. He tried to bring back the plane, but in the snow and with the rudder already lost, it was impossible. The NTSB recorded that the accident was not caused by a single error, but by a combination of factors: a snow strip, the tailwind component. The thrust reversal is above the recommendations. Thrust asymmetry, attention tunneling under high workload conditions. Each factor alone would not necessarily lead to an accident, but combined, they created a situation from which the crew had no way out. The investigation revealed another important detail. Many MD-80 pilots at Delta used reverse as aggressively as Lauer, especially in short lanes. It was an unspoken habit formed over decades of exploitation. The pilots trusted their experience in reverse even more than the recommendations from the manual. Flight 1086 was the rare occasion when this habit showed its danger. That is why the NTSB has sent the airline several recommendations. Introduce a procedure according to which the co-pilot is obliged to warn the commander if the reverse speed exceeds 1.3 on a slippery runway, to work out mechanisms for training pilots to avoid tunneling. Consider setting a warning indicator when the EPR value is high in reverse mode. The engineers and pilots agreed. Such an accident could only happen on an aircraft with tail engines. In modern aircraft with engines under the wing, the flow from the reverse has much less effect on the rudder. What was really important in the end? It's not that the plane was seriously damaged. The main thing is that aviation has learned its lesson again. And again, I took apart every detail, as small as the movement of a lever by a fraction of a centimeter, and as large as the psychological state of a pilot in a snowstorm, when dozens of lives are at stake. The MD-88 standing on a snow-covered embankment was a silent reminder. There are no small things in aviation, even if everything ends up being saved. The investigation continued for months. The NTSB labs analyzed the parameters, endlessly scrolling through the flight recordings. Experts compared the data with weather conditions, the condition of the runway, and reports from other crews. At the same time, Delta pilots were interviewed. Their habits, their attitude to reverse gear, and their perception of slippery lanes were studied. The results of these interviews turned out to be no less important than the data from the recorders. Many pilots, without violating the rules, admitted, "Yes, we often increase the reverse. On short strips, it's a habit. It gives you a sense of control." It is this phrase, "gives a sense of control," that has become a kind of key to understanding the accident. It wasn't the technique that failed. Let down by the fact that a person accustomed to relying on experience sometimes ignores his own limitations. The fate of the pilots themselves was professionally difficult. The commander and the first officer had to participate in dozens of hours of interviews, analyzing every second of the landing. There were no accusations in the usual sense, but there was professional responsibility. Aviation is designed in such a way that even a small error is analyzed as a serious system element. No experience frees you from debriefing. Commander Lauer admitted that he had not controlled the reverse readings when he should have, that his attention was overloaded, that he didn't hear his colleagues' warning right away, not because he ignored it, but because his brain was processing too much disturbing information at that moment. The investigators emphasized that Lauer had not lost his head. He acted logically in an environment where logic had changed under the influence of stress. And at this point, documentaries often emphasize that there is a person working in the cockpit. Not a car. It's not an ideal neural network. Human. And in some circumstances, human reactions inevitably differ from the theoretically ideal ones. Meanwhile, a whole infrastructure of consequences began to be built around MD-88. Delta conducted an internal investigation. The training centers were urgently updating their training programs. The instructors added new exercises, landing on a polluted runway with narrowed attention, working out situations where the pilot intentionally tunnels the focus. Crews learned to identify this effect from a cockpit partner, just as they learned to notice an inadequate response to an engine failure or a dangerous instrument malfunction. All this happened against the background of a quiet but large-scale change. MD-88 was becoming a thing of the past. This family of aircraft has served a generation of pilots, but the industry has already shifted to more modern aircraft. Boeing 737NG, Airbus A320neo, then A220, and new configurations, in which the engines under the wing provided more predictable rudder blowing. In tailplanes such as the MD-80, reverse has always been a compromise, a convenient braking system, but technically difficult in terms of aerodynamics. Where the airflow could block the sensitivity of the rudders, the situation could become unstable. Most modern airliners no longer have this problem. Aviation service reports after Flight 1086 explicitly stated, "Switching to wing engines reduces the risk of similar accidents in the future." Indeed, after a few years, MD-88s left the fleets of almost all major airlines. Delta decommissioned them last in the United States, holding a symbolic farewell flight in 2020. That classic silhouette, familiar to passengers for decades, has become part of history. But it wasn't just the model itself. The main conclusions concerned the human factor. The NTSB has formulated recommendations that pilots around the world are currently studying. On slippery lanes, reverse should be used predictably, with limitations. One pilot is required to monitor the EPR values as closely as the other pilot monitors the course. Any deviations from the recommendations should be accompanied by a loud warning. Crews should train for situations when the commander loses focus under the influence of stress. Companies must take into account that the pilot is a human being, and the human is not perfect. The results were clear. It wasn't just the reverse. The fact is that the pressure accumulated an hour before landing narrowed the commander's attention faster than the snow on the runway. Uncertainty, conflicting reports, fear of procrastination, and the desire to meet deadlines all affected perception. When the runway appeared, he saw the goal to stop the plane, and this goal blocked the ability to perceive the rest. Meanwhile, the passengers recalled the incident in their own way. Some are like a moment of horror when the plane began to glide towards the bay. Others are like an amazing escape without injury. Still others are like a strange vacuum of silence after stopping. But they all had one thing in common. No one realized how thin the line was separating them from a more serious outcome. From the point of view of aviation, they survived one of the most dangerous scenarios associated with landing on a snow-covered runway. And the fact that no one was seriously injured was a combination of luck, the design features of the aircraft, and the actions of the crew, who, despite mistakes, still retained control where they could. A year after the incident, the NTSB released its final report. It described in detail about exceeding the reverse, about the inefficiency of the rudder in the conditions of blackout, about the effect of stress on the commander's attention, the need for systemic changes. The document was dry and technical, but behind every point there was a real situation from a snowy March morning. At the end of the report, there was a phrase that is often found in NTSB documents. The purpose of this investigation is to prevent such events, not to find the culprits, but to create conditions for a safer future. That is why such incidents are so important. They are not a memory of what went wrong, but the foundation on which the next generation of security is being built. Today, when modern aircraft enter LaGuardia in winter, pilots have more accurate braking data, more attention-sharing procedures, and more advanced thrust control systems. This is a direct consequence of the lessons learned that day. And when a new aircraft enters the runway 13 glide path in the snow, where the MD-88 once descended, its crew knows that this story is not just an incident. It is part of the entire aviation memory. A memory written by a cold wind, a short streak, narrowed attention, and incredible luck. And thanks to this memory, thousands of planes today land safely, where once one lost control for just a few seconds.